Having formed in the Cape Verde Islands and grown in intensity as it crossed the Atlantic, Hurricane Hugo made landfall in the Caribbean on the 15th of September, smashing through Guadeloupe and Montserrat, destroying thousands of homes and devastating the banana, coconut palm and sugar plantations on which the island's economies relied. Proceeding northwest, it tore through the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, winds gusting up to 168 miles an hour, 270 kilometers an hour. On the US Virgin Island of St. Croix, it's estimated that over 90% of buildings on the island were damaged and over $500 million of property damage in total was done. The storm brought surge waves and damage to the coast of South Carolina, where Hugo was the strongest hurricane to hit the mainland US since 1969. Losing strength as it headed inland, it went north along the Atlantic coast, bringing floods and high winds all the way north to Canada before finally petering out in southern Greenland. The final death toll was 67 directly attributable to the hurricane, with a further 40 during the cleanup phase. In fact, in South Carolina, more people died cleaning up after the hurricane than during it. The US also had to deploy troops to St. Croix to deal with a spate of looting, the first time since the riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King that US troops had been deployed domestically, and Hugo's economic cost would run into billions. On the 22nd of September, a time bomb exploded in the changing rooms at the Royal Marine School of Music in Deal, Kent. It went off at 8:22 a.m, by which time most of the Marines in the barracks were already on the parade ground, but the building then collapsed, killing 11 and injuring 21 more. The Kent Ambulance Service was actually on strike at the time, but they quickly agreed to end the industrial action and come to help, with most of the casualties trapped under rubble, though one body was found on the roof of a nearby house. The IRA quickly claimed responsibility, and while the general public in Britain had become used to attacks against military and government facilities, the targeting of a ceremonial ban shocked many, while questions were asked of the private security firm to whom the Ministry of Defence had subcontracted security at the base. And as the Grand Prix cars were out qualifying at Estoril, a ceasefire was agreed in Lebanon, ending for the time being at least the civil war that had been going on in various guises since 1975. There had been ceasefires before and fighting had always resumed, so nobody was holding their breath, but there did seem to be a sense of optimism this time, with Syria and Israel both cautiously willing, and Saudi Arabia offering a neutral ground to host talks. The F1 circus arrived in Portugal for the start of its two-race Iberian tour, with Estoril having proved a popular destination with a series of cracking races. Williams were debuting their new car, the FW13, which was either 12 races late for the start of 1989 or 4 races early for 1990. It was shorter and wider than the previous car, with revised front suspension giving it a double hump on the nose, but the most obvious feature was the wide-mouthed air intake above the drivers' heads. Elsewhere in the pit lane, McLaren had been doing some testing at the Hungaroring between races and had made some adjustments to the balance of their cars, while the Onyx team seemed to be having some internal trouble. Despite his decent showing in Italy, Bertrand Gachot had publicly criticised the car and been summarily sacked by team co-owner and main sponsor Jean-Pierre Van Rossum, with Finnish Formula 3000 driver JJ Leto taking the wheel at Estoril. Jyrki Juhani Järvileto was a protege of 1982 champion Keke Rosberg, and it was Rosberg's idea to abbreviate his name to JJ Leto to make it less of a mouthful for us Anglophones. Leto began in karts at the age of 8 and did well enough to graduate to Formula Ford at 15 before moving on to the British racing scene. He won the British and European Formula 2000 titles in 1987 and followed that up with the British F3 title in 1988. For 1989 he was given the opportunity to test for Ferrari, as well as moving up to Formula 3000 with the successful Pacific team. Results in Formula 3000 were harder to come by, and his best was a 4th place in Pau, but nonetheless he was regarded as a fine driver for the future. Elsewhere there was news for 1990. Arrows confirmed that as well as Derek Warwick leaving for Lotus, both driver Eddie Cheever and designer Ross Brawn would be leaving the team at the end of 1989, with Michele Alboreto signing up on driving duties. Brawn was reported to be heading to Tom Walkinshaw's Jaguar sports car team, while Cheever hadn't confirmed a destination yet, but seemed to be generally fed up with F1, and rumours said he was considering moving stateside and giving IndyCar a go. Ligier, meanwhile, had announced that René Arnoux would be hanging up his helmet at the end of the season, and his place would be taken by Nicola Larini. And Minardi had announced that they wouldn't be racing with the Subaru Flat 12 engine they'd been helping to test and develop for 1990, and would instead be continuing with good old reliable Ford V8 power. It was the penultimate race of the Formula 3000 season at the Bugatti circuit in Le Mans, and Jean Alesi could clinch the title with just 1 point there, so Johnny Herbert was once again filling in for Ken Tyrrell, only to come down with a bout of food poisoning soon after arriving. Pre-qualifying saw Stefan Johansson put Onyx back on top of the timing sheets, half a second ahead of Alio's Lola, with Moreno an excellent third in the Coloni. Yannick Dalmas would have been third, but he was disqualified after using the wrong tyres by mistake, so Alboreto took fourth in the Lola, while Leto's debut was rather spoiled by a broken suspension, and he failed to make the cut, though was still quicker than the rest, with Larini also disqualified for missing a weight check, and Battaglio once more vastly off the pace in the second Coloni. Senna dominated qualifying proper as usual, top of both days' sessions, 2 seconds under Prost's 1988 pole time and half a second ahead of second place Berger. Pierluigi Martini in the Minardi turned a few heads by going third fastest on Friday, and even though he dropped behind Mansell and Prost on Saturday, he still lined up a best ever fifth, alongside his countryman Riccardo Patrese in the new Williams. Like Martini, Alex Caffey made good use of the excellent Pirelli qualifying rubber to qualify 7th, with Boots an 8th, and Sala his best ever 9th in the other Minardi. The Pirelli shod Brabhams were next, followed by Johansson's Onyx. The Benettons, meanwhile, were suffering from twitchy handling on the bumpy Estoril circuit and could only manage 13th and 16th, with Moreno placing his Pirelli shod Coloni in the team's best ever grid slot of 15th. If Benetton were having a bad day, Lotus were doing even worse, with Piquet a thoroughly disgruntled 20th and Nakajima just scraping in at 25th. Eddie Cheever once again only just made it in, 2 tenths ahead of an unwell Johnny Herbert, with Guiar joining Herbert and the Reals in sitting out race day. The German cars a full 2 seconds slower even than Olivier. It was in Estoril last year that we saw the first cracks in the relationship between Prost and Senna, when the Brazilian nearly crowded the Frenchman into the pit wall, so all eyes would be on the 2 McLarens today, but the Ferraris were also going really well, and there was interest to see how the shaken-up grid would affect things. The Pirelli's race tyres were widely regarded as being inferior to Goodyear's, but just having both Minardis in the top 10 could certainly throw a spanner into a few people's races. Senna had an off in Sunday morning's practice, and Mansell's Ferrari needed a new left rear shock absorber, but there were no serious problems as everyone lined up on the grid. It was a hot day and getting hotter, and tyre choice was going to be vital. The Goodyear runners had a choice of the harder B or the semi-soft C compounds. McLaren and Ferrari both chose Cs all round, but there could be an advantage for a team willing to risk the slower but more durable Bs and try and go through without a stop. The green light shone, and Berger got an absolute flying start, out-dragging Senna down to turn 1 and cutting across him to retain the lead. Mansell nearly followed Berger through in turn 1, but had to settle for third for the time being, with Prost still 4th and Martini hanging on to 5th. Berger put his foot down and charged, trying to put as much fresh air between himself and the rest as possible. By the end of lap 2, the gap was over 2 seconds, but of course there was a lot of race still to go, and Berger was still looking for just his second finish of the year. Meanwhile, Senna was holding off Mansell, with both of them drawing away from 4th place Prost, who still had Martini hanging onto his rear wing. And behind the Minardi was a train led by the 2 Williamses, but they didn't seem to be making much impression on him. Mansell was clearly able to go faster than Senna, and continued attacking the McLaren until finally on lap 8 he got his positioning just right, got a tow down the main straight, and slingshotted past into turn 1. A Ferrari won too, for the moment at least, and Prost had now also caught up to his teammate to boot. So, with one exception, it was a Noah's Ark formation, 2 by 2, on lap 10 as 2 Ferraris led 2 McLarens, 1 Minardi and 2 Williamses, with Johansson's Onyx 8th, Caffey's Dallara 9th, and Sala's second Minardi 10th. The first casualty of the race was Roberto Moreno, whose Coloni fuel pump packed up and parked opposite the pits on the main straight after 11 laps. Martini, meanwhile, was still fending off Patrese and Boots and doing his future employment prospects no harm at all, and he didn't seem to actually be having too much trouble keeping the 2 former race winners behind him. Mansell, meanwhile, had put the hammer down and was whittling away at Berger's lead, setting a succession of fastest laps while Berger was starting to encounter backmarkers, the first of which was Arnoux, who held him up round the infield, while Mansell was lucky and got past easily on the straight. There was a clutch of 6 cars next, and by the time Berger was halfway through and trying to line up a pass on the powerful V12 Lamborghini-powered Lola of Alboreto, Mansell was right with him and looking for a way past. Both of them squeezed past Alboreto and continued battling nose to tail. A couple of laps later they came up to Warwick and Modena, who'd been dropping back with a handling problem. As Warwick pulled out to take the Brabham, Mansell pulled out to take the lead. They went 3 abreast down the main straight, Warwick caught in a bit of a dilemma, and Berger entirely boxed in, so Mansell went into lap 24 in the lead, while Senna had done his usual blast through the traffic to catch right up behind Berger. Cheever spun off at the last corner, and one of the track marshals had to hastily rethink crossing the track as the leaders came round, and then on lap 28, Prost was the first of the front runners to stop for tyres, rejoining 8th. On lap 35 it was Berger's turn, promoting Senna to 2nd and Pierluigi Martini to the dizzy heights of 3rd. It was a cracking stop as well, putting him out in 5th, while Senna came in next lap and the McLaren team had an unusually bad one, taking double the time stationary. Prost on new tyres and Mansell on his old ones were trading fastest laps, as Piquet and Caffey had an off-camera coming together in midfield, sending both of them out. Finally, on lap 40, Mansell peeled in from the lead and suddenly, and gloriously, Pierluigi Martini led the race in his Minardi. But everyone was watching Nigel as he thundered into the pits, only to miss his pit and overshoot. With the Ferrari mechanics frantically gesticulating at him, Nigel threw it into reverse, backed up to the right spot, already nearly 10 seconds in before they even started changing his tyres. He tore out of the pit lane with 20 seconds on the clock, rejoined 4th, and set about recovering what he'd lost. Warwick ran into the back of Sala off-camera and demolished the front end of his car, nearly collecting Alboreto as he looked for a safe place to pull over, and just then Pierluigi Martini's single lap in the lead was over as Berger stormed past, quickly followed by Senna. Mansell was charging, breaking the lap record, and soon he was also past Martini and on Senna's tail. But as he passed the pit wall, out went a black flag with a board reading 27. He was to come in and be disqualified for reversing in the pit lane. Only he didn't. The flag went out again. Still nothing. 3rd time around they were supplemented with a Ferrari pit board reading Mansell in, but still he stayed out, either so laser-focused on the back of Senna's McLaren that he just wasn't looking at the pit wall as he passed, or hoping that it could all be smoothed over before he had to come in. And then, on lap 48, it all became academic as Mansell made a move, Senna turned in, there was contact, and both cars ended up in the sand trap on 3 wheels apiece. Ron Dennis ran down the pit to remonstrate furiously with the Ferrari personnel, while Senna just stared into the middle distance, and the black flag was rather sheepishly taken down. Well, that one was clearly going to run, and could end up being the decisive controversy of the season, with Senna's chances of the title being dealt a mortal blow by a car that shouldn't have been on the track. In the meantime, and with 13 laps to go, Berger had a big lead over Prost in 2nd place, with Stefan Johansson now up to 3rd in the Onyx, gambling on not making a pit stop. Behind him were the 2 Williamses and Nannini's Benetton, which had come up well from 13th and had just nudged Martini out of the points. Patrese reeled in Johansson and took 3rd from the Swede, the new Williams Renault looking good on its debut. Until a lap later when both cars expired simultaneously, both with overheating engines caused by rubbish in their intakes. By this time, all the top 6 had over 10 seconds between them, so there wasn't much change in the last few laps as Berger cruised to the 4th win of his 3-year Ferrari career and his 5th overall, to take the Scuderia into 2nd in the Constructors' race, with Prost a very satisfied 2nd, and Stefan Johansson making an unexpected but very welcome return to the podium to cap what had turned out to be a very encouraging weekend for the little Onyx team. Nannini was 4th, and Williams's woe was Minardi's delight as Pierluigi Martini capped his best day ever with 2 points. Jonathan Palmer picked up the final point for Tyrrell after starting back in 18th, while Nakajima had driven a quiet but very solid race to go from 25th on the grid to 7th at the flag. So Prost gained 4 points after discarding his 5th place finish from Mexico, leaving him on 75 to Senna's 51. Ayrton would now need to win all of the remaining 3 races, which would put him on 78 points, with Prost scoring no more than 3 points net. Prost was definitely in control going into the last 3 races, while Senna would be absolutely fuming about today's incident.
Alboreto. M-A, like Mario Andretti.
Ivan Capelli, with one P and double L.
My name in Portuguese should be pronounced Gugelmin, but in England they say Gugelmin, which is easy for them.
Warwick. It's not as Diane, Warwick, it's Warwick. Without, you don't pronounce the second W.
In French is Alliot, but if the American people want to say Elliot, it's no problem for me.
In Portuguese we pronounce Piquet.
John Alesi. Emanuele Pirro.
First of all, it's not Ayrton like all Americans or English people used to say. It's Ayrton. And so it's Ayrton Senna da Silva.
When I was young it was Pro. Yeah. And then when I started to go motor racing it was Prost, because I think it was easier for them to pronounce that. And he said Prost. I have no problem.
My correct pronunciation of my name is Christmas dinner.